You and I stand on the leading edge of a broadcasting future that is going to be more exciting, more fun, more profitable than anything we have ever seen in the past. Local broadcast is in the best position of any media to take advantage of fundamental shifts in the way consumers use and share information. But it is not going to be easy. The future requires us to make a cultural shift. We must stop accepting the idea of smaller audiences, stop assuming younger viewers are not interested in news, stop thinking we can only do news one way. We must start taking control. For the next few minutes, we are going to talk about one path to the future that is available right now. We begin 500 years ago in 1517 when an obscure and unknown monk named Martin Luther changed the world. Luther disagreed with the established church's practices of selling indulgences, that is, forgiving sin for cash. And Luther was so upset about this that he decided to use the media to go public. But how do you go public in the early 16th century? Printing presses existed, but no newspapers, and certainly that would not have been available to a poor monk in Germany. The answer was that Luther wrote out what he called his thesis. He went to the town square and he nailed it to the church door. And that was mass media in the early 16th century. Within 6 months, Luther's treatise had been translated into every European language. It had been printed in every language and is still being read today. And so from Luther, we learn the first and most important lesson of media, and that is that the power is always in the content. Now, you and I know this, but we tend to forget it because we get so wrapped up in things like technology and platforms and consumers that we forget that the power is fundamentally in the content. Now let's fast forward 250 years or so to the British colonies in the Americas. At the beginning of 1776, they were embroiled in a bloody tax revolt. In 6 months, from January the 1st to July 4th, that tax revolt had turned into a movement for a new nation, a declaration of independence. What changed in 6 months? One thing. A person named Thomas Paine decided, like Luther, that he would use the media and go public. In Paine's case, he printed a pamphlet. And he passed this pamphlet out. He didn't even have his name on it because he feared a British noose around his neck. And like Luther, Paine was able to make an incredible and immediate impact across a wide group of people. The pamphlet was handed from person to person to person. And so from Paine, we learn the second most important lesson in media, and that is not only is the power in the content, but content always gravitates to the latest technology. And this is true throughout history. In the 1850s, a novel was used by Harriet Beecher Stowe. In the 1930s, Franklin Roosevelt used network radio. In my own lifetime, Martin Luther King in the 1960s used network television. Content always gravitates to the latest technology. And so we shouldn't be surprised that people love their smartphones. We shouldn't be surprised that people are interested in the latest technology. It's always been that way. These two keys are important in part because of what our broadcast culture believes. Broadcast culture says that the power is in our platform. Well, that's understandable. We have strong and powerful platforms. But if we orient our thinking to our platforms, we miss the future and allow someone else to take over. Because we are so wrapped up in our platforms, we fear the latest technology, and this is also a mistake. New technology will work for broadcasters perhaps better than anyone else, as we'll see in a few moments. These are the cultural issues which we must overcome. And I submit to you that broadcasters have a wonderful history of incredible innovation. It only happens when broadcasters' backs are to the wall, but it's happened time and again. I submit to you that broadcasters are by far in the best position to take advantage of the future. Why? Well, first of all, as broadcasters, we are already content-centric. We think about content. Whether it's radio or television news, content is really our thing. We don't necessarily give it the credit it deserves, but it's what we do. We have massive launch pads. In fact, the only massive launch pads that are left. Newspapers, because they have less than 50% penetration, are now by definition a niche media. That leaves television primarily, along with radio, as the only massive launch pads in existence. We have an existing relationship with the consumer, and the future is all about relationships. We have a place to start with the consumer. We don't have to create it from scratch. We are powerful forces in our communities, and in many cases, we are the most powerful forces in our community. Who gets the attention when disasters happen? Who gets the attention when big news stories happen? It's broadcasting. We're resource rich. And no matter what a station may complain about wanting more, the reality is, compared to everybody else, we have incredibly rich resources. And by nature, we are highly competitive. So think about these and put them together. Who else has this? And I would suggest no one has it. Now, the fact is, we have a history of innovation. And let's talk about that. It only happens when our backs are to the wall, but it has happened time and time again. In the late 1930s, radio owned in-home evening entertainment in our nation. Network radio programs were produced by ad agencies. Local stations carried those networks. They were paid by the networks, and they were able to sell commercials adjacent to those programs. That was the radio business in the late 1930s, and it was a wonderful business. If you owned a local radio station, that's sort of what you did. But then something happened that was pretty bad for radio, and that is that television took this entire model and moved it to a brand new industry. And it's so long ago, none of us were around in 1950, that we don't realize how devastating this was. Local radio stations were out of business. They had no way to survive. And so what did they do? Well, of course, they reinvented themselves as a local community service. And instead of being a nighttime service, it was a daytime service. It was still in home. It went primarily to women who were at home. And this was a fantastic business for about 20 years, when it too was destroyed, because in the 1970s, women went into the workforce. And television was 24 hours a day. And radio, for the second time in 20 years, lost its business model, lost its reason for being. So what happened? Well, radio owners dusted off their FM frequencies that people had just sort of been holding on to. They made them stereo. They got Congress to change the laws so that car radios had to have FM and then eventually stereo, and they created a FM stereo in-car music service that is still a great business today. But think about this. This was the third iteration of radio. But what of AM? I was working in Washington in the early 1980s when NBC decided to turn off WRC, their 50,000 watt AM radio station. AM died in the early 1980s, but of course we still have AM because AM reinvented as AM talk. Now, do we have the number of AM radio stations today that we once had? Of course not. Is radio dead in AM? Of course not. The lesson here is, when backs are to the wall, broadcasters can reinvent. But it only happens when our backs are to the wall. I would suggest that's the attitude that we need to have now. Here is the model of the way media works, at least in our world. This is the way business is organized if you're a local broadcaster. We believe that the consumer has limited media choices: television, newspaper, radio. Well, what's happened? That's of course not the case anymore. Newspaper, we've already talked about, has a problem. But the reality is we're still organized as a business in broadcasting based on this idea you see here. Not the reality of what's going on, but this idea. When we produce news, when we sell advertising, our thinking, unfortunately, is often limited by this. Well, what's the real world? And it's upside down. The problem is, this world is upside down. We need to adjust ourselves for this world. Why did this happen? Well, what I like to call the two cultural tsunamis have changed everything about broadcasting. The first, of course, is choice, and we're all familiar with fragmentation, beginning with cable and satellite, the internet, mobile. I'm not going to spend time on this. You know all about it. What choice does is it moves power to the chooser, therefore power to the consumer. The other social tsunami, which is perhaps even more powerful, is now connectivity. Connectivity is the ability to consumers to speak with each other, to speak with us, to cut out the middleman if they want to. This is absolutely amazing. And these are not technical tsunamis. Technology enabled them. But understand these are cultural movements. And that's the way we must think of them. Because the consumer, because of these two factors, now controls the future. So in a world where the consumer is on top and media power is limited, how does the consumer think? Have they changed, or do they mentally look at the world in a different way? Here's the way consumers see the world. Let's take our target, which is normally a woman. She thinks in terms first today of her phone. When she thinks of television, she says cable. She may mean over the air, she may mean satellite, but that's sort of become the catchword. Tablets, car radios. You don't hear that a lot, but they're just as important to her as they ever were because they're using the car. Of course, there's the movement in television back toward over the air, along with over the top, great things. E-readers, which are quickly going away, which is why Barnes & Noble has made a deal with Samsung to do their latest tablet. That's about tablets. Magazines. Do you realize that magazines are still an incredibly powerful force? This is the way the consumer looks at the media world, but her world is much bigger than that. Her world includes Starbucks and health clubs and commutings and all these other things that take up her time. And when you ask women about their lives today, if you say, does anyone ever in this group ever feel overwhelmed, you always get a lot of hands that come up. When you ask women, do you wish the world was a little simpler, you get a lot of hands that go up. And here is the typical woman consumer today. She suffers from lack of sleep and exhaustion. Now, if you don't believe this, ask her. She'll tell you. This is a tough world that women live in, but it's also a world that offers us as broadcasters new opportunities that we've never had before if we will simply understand her and then ask her what she wants. This world, I think, is best defined by Levine's three truths. John Levine, who is a guy that I've admired for a long time, believes that we now live in a world of overwhelming information, a world where more information will come to you and me today than we can possibly deal with, than we can possibly understand. And yet it's there. It's overwhelming. And yet each one of us today has 1,440 minutes, and that's it. If you slept 8 hours last night, that leaves you with 960 minutes. John believes that the average person has 20 minutes a day just to themselves. It's a staggering thought. How do you deal with this? And if these two things weren't enough, the world is becoming ever more complex every day. Buy a new car. You better learn how to use the electronics. And if you have two cars, it's very confusing if they're different brands because of all of these things. Complexity is rising and rising and rising. And so how does the consumer deal with this? Well, most information never achieves cognition. And here's what I mean by that. I mentioned Costco a moment ago. Costco is a brand that women love. Ask a woman who loves Costco what the floor of Costco is made out of. Most of the time, she won't know. Why? Because the floor of Costco bears no relevance to her life. She doesn't see things that have no relevance to her life. That's why outdoor advertising has issues. That's why it is so difficult now to get this person to pay attention to you, because she has so little time, she's so overwhelmed. Life is not easy, especially if you're in a business like ours, which is all about engagement. So we're trying to engage this person who's busy and making choices. The way the consumer navigates this world is through brand. Now, for this purpose, don't think of brand as advertising or branding campaigns and all of those things. Let's talk about brand from the consumer's perception. A brand is the first thing the consumer thinks when seeing or hearing your name. Brand bears no relationship to what we would like it to be. The consumer is in total charge of determining our brand. Let's take a non-broadcast example to talk about this. When Hyundais were first introduced into the U.S. 30 years ago, they were pretty bad cars. They rusted, they were undependable, and so Hyundai's brand was cheap Korean car that's unreliable. Now, obviously, Hyundai did not like their brand and they wanted to change it. So what did they do? Well, they made the cars better. They improved them, they stopped the rust, they fixed them so that they didn't break down, but they still couldn't sell them because the brand was cheap Korean car that's unreliable. So Hyundai introduced the 100,000-mile warranty. The 100,000-mile warranty was a real thing. And over time, it changed their brand to cheap Korean car that is reliable. Now, I'm sure they wanted more out of the 100,000-mile warranty than that, but this is from the consumer's point of view. But it was a good thing. Hyundai could sell cars. They could sell a $17,000 or $18,000 car. They couldn't sell a $25,000 car, so what did they do? Well, they moved design and manufacturing to the U.S. Suddenly the cars were stylish, they were fashionable, they looked good. And so once again, Hyundai's brand changed, this time to cheap Korean car I'm not embarrassed to drive. That's great. Good place if you want to sell a $25,000 car. Hyundai, though, did not stop there. They not only continued to improve their cars, but they began to add things as standard equipment that other people charge for. So now Hyundai had a nice looking car, it was competitive, and it was a much better value than many other cars. And I would suggest that Hyundai's brand today is about as good as Japanese cars, but cheaper. As you can see, the fundamental brand has always stayed with Hyundai. You can modify the brand, but once it's locked into the consumer, you can't easily change it. Here's some things we know about this consumer who is judging us based on brand. First of all, our brand is based on every contact. If you are a television news station and you have a terrible anchor on at 7 a.m. Sunday morning, that affects your brand. It affects what people think of the evening newscast Monday through Friday. It's a world of every contact. It's the little things that build brand. Consumers now not only want a two-way conversation, they demand one. A letter to the editor, commenting on a Facebook page is not enough. The consumers want a measure of control. They want to be involved in the process. Consumers now demand that information be delivered on their terms. A woman who does not get up at 6 a.m., a woman only gets up at 7, is not going to be available to watch a newscast at 6 a.m. If they get up at 7, they're available at 7. On her terms, not our terms. And here's a big one, a huge opportunity. She wants to create content. She wants a two-way conversation, but she also wants to be a contributor. Now, this is scary to us because it affects our culture. We think we'll lose control if we let her in. How can we do this? Well, I got to tell you, she's going to achieve this. And if we don't do it for her, someone else will. Her time is now clearly more important than her money. And this is a change over the past 20 years. Keurig coffee pots are built upon the idea that time is more invaluable than money. Jimmy John's subs. If you want a custom sub, go to Subway. If you want a sub that's you can't change, you can't modify, you might or might not like, but you want it fast, go to Jimmy John's. You pay for the sub, and then they hand you the change and the sub. Call them to deliver at your home, they'll get it there quickly. Time is more important than money. This is also an opportunity for you and me. Many, many years ago when I was in the news consulting business, we used to talk about Joe's six-pack. Wow, would that be a mistake today? Today's consumer, no matter what their socioeconomic status is, no matter their age, is sophisticated, they're technically savvy, and in the case of women, they are very loyal to brands that they trust. Here is our opportunity. No one wants to get up in the morning, look at news stories from around the world and try to decide what's important. I like Flipboard. I like News 360. But those are not trusted sources for me. Those are simply aggregation services. The person who can be the trusted source to a woman who by nature is loyal to people and to brands she trusts, what a huge opportunity that is. But understand also this woman will not forgive betrayal. Don't make promises you can't keep, or she'll make you pay for it. This is not a strategic planning session, but I do want to spend a few moments talking about the basics of strategic planning because they've changed. In years past, we would do research, we'd look for voids in the market, we would look at a number 1 station, a number 3 station, we would look at opportunities of things people seem to be interested in. I think that's not the way you've got to look at the world today. That's not going to work. Many of those made great doorstops, but today I think we must begin with an honest and frank brand analysis. Now, you may not be able to do this for yourself. You may be too close to it, but you need to begin to understand how the consumer actually looks at you. Warts and all. That, like Hyundai, where they began, we must also begin with reality. Persona is a huge opportunity for us today. It's a great way to look at the consumer. If you're not familiar with persona, look it up, spend some time. Today, we must have a target, and the easy way, or at least one way to understand that target, is through persona. Now here's the big one. Ask yourself, not little questions, but the big question. What will so engage, so delight your target that she will not only be loyal to you, she will become your advocate? What is that thing? And that thing is not just something simple. It's something important and that matters to her. What is it? Be honest with yourself. Don't be locked into old thinking. What can you do? And once you answer that question, then you must ask yourself, are you actually willing to do it? You know, in broadcasting, especially television, we tend to copy each other. It's why news is homogenized. It's why so much of it looks alike. It's why a station that's at the bottom of the ratings heap now is almost impossible to ever get to the top because they're so locked in. So if there's nothing that you can do that your competitors can't do, then the question becomes, what are you willing to do that your competitors are not willing to do? And then you must ask, if you're willing to do it, will your culture allow it? Culture is a huge force. I think it's the greatest force today in broadcasting. It's the biggest thing we have to overcome. And then this question, what are you willing to give up? Being all things to all people is no longer an option. Not if you want an important and viable business in the future. Briefly, here are some errors. Michael Porter at Harvard, who invented the term operational excellence and has written so much on that, and I think Porter's exactly right. Operational excellence is the cost of entry, it's not a strategy. In the past, in television news, operational excellence we thought was a strategy. If it ever was, it's not today. Layered messaging is a mistake. You've got to have one message. Inconsistent product, and it's amazing how inconsistent most product is. Obviously, product marketing mismatch. Magic bullets are a huge error. Magic bullets can actually turn around and bite you in the butt. Anticipantment, a term actually coined by a friend of mine named Jim Ellis. So you say to the viewers, the greatest thing in the world that you've ever seen on television is happening on Monday, and they tune in and it's a different anchor and a different news set, and they say, what happened to the greatest thing I ever saw? And finally, if you have no unique consumer benefit, unique to you, that's an error. Here's some things we know about the future. We know first that this power shift to consumers is permanent. It's not going back the other way. The consumer will actually gain more power as time goes on. Technology is speeding up. And technology is now driven by consumer adoption. Technology is not created in a vacuum. It's created based on what consumers want and need. And what do consumers want and need? They want simplification. They want a trusted source. They want their world to become clearer. Because consumers are absolutely overwhelmed, women and men, and not just by information, but by the complexity and choices and businesses of their everyday lives. So simplification, integration, and on demand. This is where technology is going. It's really nuts to think that you have to pull this device out of your pocket and do sort of things to sort of connect. We'll see more and more of wearable technology, and we'll see other things, but the main thing we will see is integration, simplification, and then unique on demand. This will also bring great personalization and individual control. And of course, we've already seen a growing immunity to advertising. This is why you see so much emphasis now on content marketing, content advertising. But every consumer wants a trusted source. I cannot overemphasize how big an opportunity this is for you. If you are the trusted source, then you're at a great place. And finally, platforms die. They don't actually die, but they're always modified and changed. But brands survive. Our future is about a brand. Ask yourself this question. If a 25-year-old woman will value your brand above all others, what are you willing to do? Are you willing to adjust your product? Are you willing to change your platform? Are you willing to adjust your schedule to meet her needs? What are you willing to do to satisfy this woman's needs? The bottom line is that broadcasting, television and radio, is in the best position of any media to create the future. The future is a matter of serving individual consumers in groups in ways that they've never been served before. No one is in a position to do this the way local broadcasting can.